There's a moment in life when the silence around you becomes louder than any argument. And for me, that moment arrived on a quiet Monday morning when I realized I was being erased from my own life, one polite sentence at a time. My name is Alina Whitmore. I am 62 years old, born and raised in the Midwest, and for over 4 decades I lived by a simple belief. If you show up consistently, if you give more than you take, if you put family first, everything will balance out in the end. I was a fool for believing that goodness alone is a shield. I stood in my kitchen in Columbus, Ohio, barefoot on the tile I had personally chosen years earlier, holding a mug of coffee that had already gone cold, listening to my daughter-in-law explain, calmly, confidently, why it might be healthier for everyone if I started thinking about other living arrangements. She spoke as if this was a group decision, as if I hadn't written the checks, signed the mortgage, and worked double shifts as a school counselor for 31 years to make this house possible. My son sat at the table, scrolling through his phone, nodding occasionally, a man torn between comfort and conscience, choosing comfort every time. I introduced myself quietly then, not to them but to the truth I had been avoiding. I was no longer seen as a mother, a provider, or even a person, only as an obstacle. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you listening from right now? Leave your city or state in the comments, because this story didn't happen in isolation, and I know I'm not the only woman who's lived this moment. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply watched, the way women my age learn to watch, carefully, strategically, taking mental notes while everyone else assumed I was shrinking. What they didn't know was that years of counseling children taught me one thing very well. People reveal their intentions long before they act. And that morning, as sunlight crept across the countertops I paid off in full, I understood something with terrifying clarity. This wasn't the beginning of my loss. It was the beginning of my reckoning. I didn't respond right away, and that silence seemed to reassure them. People often mistake quiet for agreement, especially when it comes from a woman my age. My daughter-in-law continued talking, filling the space with logistics and justifications. How the market was good, how downsizing could be freeing, how their future required flexibility. She spoke in the language of reason, but underneath it was something colder, entitlement dressed up as concern. As she talked, my mind drifted backward through the years I had spent building this life brick by brick. I remembered sitting at my kitchen table late at night, paperwork spread out, calculating budgets after my husband passed away suddenly when I was 50. I remembered choosing stability over comfort, security over indulgence, because my son was still finding his footing, and I wanted to give him a head start I never had. I paid off this house early so he and his wife wouldn't drown in debt. I covered property taxes without complaint. I funded repairs quietly, and in doing so, I had unknowingly trained them to believe that my contributions were invisible, automatic, endless, and undeserving of acknowledgement. What hurt most wasn't the suggestion that I leave. It was the ease with which they discussed it, as if my presence had become an inconvenience instead of the foundation beneath their feet. My son finally looked up then, met my eyes for just a second, and looked away again. That was when I understood the real betrayal wasn't financial, it was moral. He knew this was wrong, and he was choosing not to stop it. I felt a tightness in my chest, not panic but recognition. This was the moment every woman eventually faces, the crossroads between preserving peace and preserving self-respect. And as I stood there, listening, nodding, letting them believe they were in control, I made a decision I would not announce aloud. I would not fight emotionally. I would not beg. I would let them underestimate me, because people are most vulnerable when they believe they've already won. That afternoon, after they left the room believing the conversation was finished, I sat alone at the dining table and let the truth settle without flinching. Grief came first, not loud, not dramatic, but sharp and private. Grief for the version of my son I thought I had raised, the one who understood loyalty not as obligation but as honor. I remembered the nights I stayed up waiting for him to come home as a teenager, the way I defended him to teachers, employers, even friends when he disappointed them. I had always believed that love, given consistently, would eventually be returned in kind. But life has a way of teaching its hardest lessons late, when the cost of ignorance is highest. As the sun shifted and the house grew quiet, something else replaced that grief: clarity. I realized I wasn't dealing with confusion or misunderstanding. I was dealing with calculation. Decisions had been made without me, about me, and for me. And suddenly, every small detail from the past few months lined up with brutal precision. The subtle questions about my finances, the sudden interest in paperwork, the way my daughter-in-law had started, helping organize documents I never asked her to touch. I stood up slowly and walked to the hallway closet, opened the small lockbox I hadn't touched in years, and pulled out the folders I kept neatly labeled: deeds, bank statements, trust documents, and the one thing they never asked about because they assumed it didn't exist: the estate plan I updated quietly after my husband died. In that moment, I understood something most people never do until it's too late. Power doesn't belong to the loudest person in the room. It belongs to the most prepared. And as I flipped through those pages, my hands steady, my breathing calm, I felt a sense of control return, not the reckless kind driven by anger, but the deliberate kind shaped by patience. They thought they were managing my future. What they didn't know was that I had already written the ending, and it did not include my silence. Over the next few days, I behaved exactly the way they expected me to. I moved gently through the house, kept my opinions soft, asked neutral questions, and let my daughter-in-law believe she was guiding me toward some inevitable transition. I watched how confident she became when she thought resistance was gone. She started talking more freely, about remodeling plans, about converting the spare room into an office, about their future in this house. My son followed her lead, relieved, grateful even, that there was no confrontation to manage. What neither of them realized was that I was studying them the same way I once studied troubled students in my counseling office, listening not to what they said, but to what they assumed. And what they assumed was devastatingly clear. They believed I had nowhere else to go, no leverage, no spine left. One evening, as we sat at the table eating dinner I had cooked, my daughter-in-law casually mentioned speaking to a real estate agent just to explore options. She said it lightly, smiling, as if it were harmless curiosity. I smiled back, nodded, and asked which firm she liked. The relief on her face was immediate. She mistook my composure for surrender. That night after they went upstairs, I returned to my room and made 3 phone calls, one to my attorney, one to my financial advisor, and one to a former colleague who specialized in elder property law. I didn't explain emotionally. I explained factually. Dates, names, documents. By the end of those calls, timelines were set, protections activated, and a plan quietly put in motion. I slept better that night than I had in months. Not because things were resolved, but because for the first time, I wasn't reacting. I was leading. And there is a deep, almost sacred calm that comes when a woman realizes she no longer needs permission to protect what she built. The shift didn't announce itself with drama or raised voices. It unfolded the way real change often does, quietly, methodically, and out of sight. Within a week, my attorney confirmed what I had suspected. While the house was occupied jointly, the financial structure behind it told a very different story. My name was on every decisive document. The mortgage had been cleared years ago using funds from an account only I controlled. The so-called updates my daughter-in-law had tried to slip into the paperwork were incomplete, unsigned, and most importantly, legally meaningless. Still, I didn't rush. I let them continue believing their narrative because confidence makes people careless. My daughter-in-law started rearranging things, small changes at first, moving furniture, talking about paint colors, discussing renovations as if they were already approved. My son echoed her plans, repeating them like facts instead of ideas. And every time they spoke, they revealed another assumption, another overreach, another misunderstanding of where authority actually lived. One afternoon, she asked me, politely, almost sweetly, if I would consider transferring utilities into their names to simplify things. I agreed without hesitation. That single request told me everything. People who rush control always start with access. That evening, after they went out, I sat at my desk and signed a different set of papers, ones that locked accounts, restricted property access, and placed formal notice on any attempted sale or refinance. The process wasn't vengeful, it was preventative. And as I sealed the envelope, I felt something rare and steady settle into my bones, the understanding that I was no longer defending myself. I was reclaiming ground that had always been mine. The first crack in their confidence appeared sooner than I expected. It came disguised as confusion. One evening, my son mentioned that the bank had asked additional questions about the property. Routine, he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice carried an edge I recognized immediately. My daughter-in-law followed with sharper inquiries the next morning, asking whether I had changed anything recently, whether I remembered signing certain forms. I met her questions with gentle curiosity, the same tone I once used with anxious parents during school conferences. What forms? Which bank? When did they say that? The more I asked, the more unsettled she became. That was when I understood how fragile control really is when it's built on assumption instead of authority. Behind the scenes, my attorney had filed formal notices that required my written consent for any transaction involving the house, sales, loans, even appraisals. Nothing dramatic. Just safeguards. And safeguards, I learned, feel like betrayal to people who never had the right to bypass you in the first place. That afternoon, I overheard them arguing behind closed doors, voices hushed but tense. My name came up more than once. Not with warmth, not with respect, with frustration. As if I were a malfunctioning appliance instead of a living woman who had built the very stability they now depended on. I stood in the hallway listening, not with heartbreak, but with resolve. They were realizing, too late, that I was not fading quietly into the background. I was standing exactly where I had always been, at the center of the structure they tried to take for granted. When the confrontation finally came, it wasn't explosive, it was desperate. My son approached me alone one afternoon, his tone carefully measured, as if he were negotiating rather than speaking to his mother. He asked if we could clear the air, said there seemed to be misunderstandings, implied that stress had caused everyone to act out of character. I listened without interrupting, studying the lines on his face, the hesitation in his eyes. This wasn't remorse, it was recalibration. When he finished, I spoke calmly and deliberately, choosing each word with care. I told him I was aware of every assumption that had been made on my behalf, every plan formed without my consent, every quiet attempt to sideline me for convenience. I told him I wasn't angry, but I was no longer willing to be managed. His expression shifted then from confidence to something closer to fear. He asked what that meant. I told him it meant boundaries, legal and personal. It meant that decisions about my home, my finances, and my future would no longer be discussed as if I weren't in the room. He tried to soften the moment, to remind me of family, of sacrifice, of all I had given. And that was when I understood the final truth. People only appeal to your generosity when they feel it slipping away. I ended the conversation gently but firmly, leaving him with a reality he could not argue. Respect is not inherited. It is earned, and once lost, it is not easily restored. After that conversation, the house felt different, not hostile, but tense, like a place where people were suddenly aware of rules they hadn't bothered to learn before. My daughter-in-law stopped making plans out loud. The casual certainty in her voice disappeared, replaced by careful politeness and questions that sounded more like requests than decisions. I watched the shift without satisfaction or guilt, because this wasn't about humiliating anyone. It was about restoring balance. Behind the scenes, paperwork continued to move quietly but decisively. The attorney confirmed what I already knew. Legally, they had no leverage. The house could not be sold, refinanced, or transferred without my direct approval, and any attempt to pressure or misrepresent my consent would carry consequences they were not prepared to face. One evening, as I watered the plants near the window, I caught my reflection in the glass. Older, yes, but straighter somehow, steadier. For years, I had unconsciously shrunk myself to keep peace, lowered my voice to avoid conflict, accepted discomfort so others could remain comfortable. Now, simply by standing still and refusing to retreat, I had changed the entire dynamic. It struck me then that this was the part of womanhood no one warns you about. The moment when people expect you to fade quietly and you decide instead to remain visible. Not loud, not bitter, just present, informed, and unmovable. The final shift came not with a threat, but with resignation. One evening, my daughter-in-law sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands folded, voice subdued. She spoke carefully, choosing words the way people do when they realize the ground beneath them is no longer solid. She said maybe they had rushed things, maybe assumptions had been made, maybe everyone needed time. I listened, the same way I had listened to hundreds of children over the years, without interruption, without judgment. When she finished, I nodded once and told her she was right about one thing. Assumptions had been made. Then I added what I had not said aloud until that moment, that this house would remain mine, that my finances were no longer open for discussion, and that any future plans involving my life would require my consent, not my compliance. There was no argument after that, no raised voice, just a quiet understanding settling into the room. A few weeks later, they began making arrangements to move. Not because I demanded it, but because the power dynamic they depended on no longer existed. As I watched boxes being packed, I felt no triumph, only relief. I had not taken anything from them. I had simply stopped allowing myself to be taken from. And in that decision, I reclaimed something far more valuable than property, my authority over my own life. When the house finally became quiet again, it wasn't the hollow silence of loss. It was the deep, steady quiet of ownership, of truth settling where it always belonged. I walked through each room slowly, touching the door frames, the walls, the small imperfections that carried decades of memory. Nothing had changed physically, yet everything felt different. I made my coffee the way I liked it, sat by the window in the morning light, and felt something I hadn't felt in years, unburdened. What happened wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense. There were no public scenes, no shouting matches, no scorched earth. This was something far more lasting. It was a reckoning rooted in self-respect. I learned that boundaries don't require cruelty to be effective, and strength doesn't need permission to exist. I didn't lose my family. I redefined the terms under which I would remain part of it. And if there's one truth I carry forward now, it's this. When a woman decides she will no longer be quietly displaced, the world around her adjusts, whether it's ready or not. If this story spoke to you, if you've ever felt pushed aside, underestimated, or quietly expected to disappear, then you understand the power of standing your ground. Subscribe to Silver Reckoning Hub for more deeply realistic, professionally told stories where dignity, patience, and wisdom lead to justice. And tell us in the comments, have you ever had to draw a line to protect what you built? Remember, don't underestimate the power of women.